conference theme this year recognizes the 40-year anniversary of this organization and an important 40 years in the history of research ethics and really the modern era of research ethics in the United States. And perhaps there's nothing more important as an occurrence or an event and a reaction to that event than the AIDS epidemic, which sits in a really unique position at the intersection of science and medicine and bioethics and policy and politics. And so Primer is greatly honored at this moment to have Anthony Fauci join us to deliver today's keynote address. As you know, Dr. Fauci is director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease at the National Institutes of Health, a position he has held for 30 years. Dr. Fauci's remarkable career of science and public service is summarized in his bio in our conference guide, and I won't repeat that all here, but I would draw your attention to it. I'll also call attention to the fact that his simple act of summarizing his lifelong accomplishments in a single paragraph, one shorter than many others in the conference guide, is a testimony to what he has described as a guiding principle drawn from his Jesuit education, that is, precision of thought and economy of expression, lessons I've never quite learned. But I expect that his brief bio also reflects his characteristic of great humility. In 2008, Dr. Fauci was awarded the Presidential Medal of Honor. And I thought that it would be interesting and appropriate to simply quote from the remarks made by the President on that day. And the President said, "The Medal of Freedom is the highest civil honor a president can bestow. The award recognizes outstanding individuals who've been leaders in their chosen fields, have led lives of vision and character, and have made especially meritorious contributions to our nation and to the world. 3 decades ago, a mysterious and terrifying plague began to take the lives of people across the world. Before this malady even had a name, it had a fierce opponent in Dr. Anthony Fauci. As the director of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases for more than, at that time, 23 years, Tony Fauci has led the fight against HIV and AIDS. He was also a leading architect and champion of the emergency plan for AIDS relief, which over the preceding 5 years has reached millions of people, preventing HIV infection in infants and easing suffering and bringing dying communities back to life." And I think there's a little more to add to that impressive testimony to his accomplishments. Before I conclude this introduction, though, I suppose I should also mention that Dr. Fauci is, in fact, a long-standing member of our Primer family, at least by marriage. Anthony's wife, a great scientist and public servant in herself, is chief of the Department of Bioethics at the National Institutes of Health Clinical Center, and her name is Christine Grady, a member of Primer and a member of its board of directors, and someone well known to many of us and to the attendees of this conference because of her presence here year after year. Now that's a power couple for you. Today, Dr. Fauci will speak on the topic, Addressing HIV/AIDS Pandemic, Ethical Challenges. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anthony Fauci to the podium.
Thank you very much, David. It's really a great pleasure to be here with you this morning to talk about this extraordinary topic, which is really historic, as David had mentioned, in and of itself, but also in its implications for so many things from policy to medicine to science to humanistic concerns, but also some ethical challenges. I want to start off by saying that not everything that I'm going to be talking about is a strict ethical issue. There are ethical implications of some of the things that I want to talk to you about, and they're really based on my experiences in different aspects of dealing with the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Now, I obviously cannot cover all of the different aspects of it, but I'd like to give you just a taste and example of some representative challenges that we have faced over the years. I also want to first give you an apologia on this, because I'm going to go through these things relatively quickly in order to cover it in the time allocated. However, I won't want you to misinterpret the speed with which I go through it with any definitive position that this is the way it is, black and white. Everything I'm going to be talking to you about, with few exceptions, and I'll point out the exceptions, are really things that are debatable, in which there are different opinions, and you have to respect the opinions on both sides, as opposed to dogmatically saying this is the way it's going to be. So what makes this, I think, important is the scope of this extraordinary pandemic. I had the opportunity, I think, privilege in some respects and pain in other respects, of being involved in HIV from about 10 days after these MMWRs have come out. The first, many of you may remember, was in June of '81, when 5 gay men from LA presented with pneumocystis pneumonia. I wasn't quite sure what that meant at the time. I put the MMWR aside and thought that this was a fluke. And then 1 month later, on the 4th of July, another report now of 26 gay men, not only from LA, but from San Francisco and New York City, not only with PCP, with Kaposi sarcoma. And those 2 MMWRs really were the life changer for me, because I decided that that's what I was going to do for the foreseeable future, which turned out to be 33 years and about 7 months of doing this every day. And unfortunately, it exploded from this to this, which is now, we can say without hyperbole, this is less than a handful, probably within the top 3 or 4 of the transforming pandemics in our history as a civilization, with 78 million deaths, currently 35 million people living with HIV. And the fact that there's still an ongoing challenge is that 1.5 million people have died last year, and 2.1 million infections have occurred. So you can imagine, within the scope of an extraordinarily, I would say transforming, I use that word, pandemic, that issues will come up that not only would be important for HIV/AIDS, but would also serve as a model and a prototype for other diseases. So I've picked out 5 issues that I'm going to go through quickly. And again, I apologize if it's quick, because it isn't as definitive as it might sound. So let's go through them, and I'm going to give you a snapshot of an example of each of these, knowing that there are many other examples. The first is what we experienced during early drug development. And I say it as starting from nothing, and the ethics in the broad sense of randomized controlled trials when everybody is dying from a disease in which there is no treatment. That is a relatively unique situation that we faced. I had been in active medicine with potentially lethal diseases for the previous 9 years before I changed my career in 1981 to focus on HIV/AIDS, and I had never seen anything remotely resembling the tension and the passion associated with a situation when people are dying from something where you have no idea what it is and you're trying to do something about it. That gave rise to something that I think was epitomized in a movie that I know many of you have seen, namely the Dallas Buyers Club, that starred Matthew McConaughey in his Academy Award winning role. And for those of you who didn't see it, it really personified the pain and the passion and the frustration of trying to do something when you had nothing. And the Buyers Club would get drugs under no clinical trial, just distribute the drugs. And there was an extraordinary argument about the time that don't even test them, just give them, because it was very frustrating. These were some of the drugs that we were faced with people essentially demanding it, and when the federal government didn't make it available, they would go through the buyers club. Namely, they would have people that would go to other countries, Mexico or whatever. The third one down is AER14. Some of you may remember Rock Hudson flew to Paris to get that from the Pasteur because he couldn't get it in the United States. There really were buyers clubs, and I had the opportunity to deal directly and develop strong relationships with people who were actually involved in the buyers club. From New York, there was Michael Callan, the folk singer who was an HIV/AIDS patient who died in 1983. And he actually started a group that actually distributed about $1 million worth of AL-721 to persons with AIDS who were desperate for treatment. There was another one on the other side of the country in San Francisco, a very, very dear friend of mine, Marty Delaney, the founding director of Project Inform, who may have been at least partially the character from whom Matthew McConaughey's Woodruff was derived, because he would go frequently from California to Mexico to pick up drugs in order to do that. Then came the issue, if there are drugs available, should you actually do a randomized controlled trial? And again, it was 30 years ago, but there was extraordinary tension then. And with some, not all, there were many activists who were demanding to do the randomized controlled trial. Not every activist wanted to just distribute drugs. So we finally did the iconic randomized controlled trial, and I want to spend half a minute on this because this is very relevant to what's going on right now with Ebola, and I know you're going to have a panel on Ebola, but I'm going to bring in Ebola occasionally during this talk in order to link it to a present-day challenge. And this is the iconic study which was done here in the United States. It was done in a very quick way, and you could see the results are pretty striking, that the individuals who received AZT, if you look at 1 death versus 19, from that point on, it was clear that this worked. Now, it's interesting because there was a gap, probably the shortest gap in the history of the FDA, between the time the data came in and the time they approved it. But once it approved it, I became the buyers club, because what I did is that we did something at the NIH that was never been done before. We actually became a drug distribution through our clinical trial networks from the time this was proven, and this paper came out months later. Unlike the New England Journal now, you send it in, it comes out 3 days later, but back then it was months later, that finally when the drug was approved, that became the standard for all subsequent trials. So as you see on this slide, the spectrum from the initial 1987 approval of AZT/zidovudine until the present day, that from then on there was no further randomized controlled trials for therapy. But the fact is, the problem didn't end there, because it became an issue of standard of care in a control group, which was another thing that we had to face. Now, the reason I bring that up is because today, as we speak, I'm faced with an issue of some people saying you should not do a clinical trial with Ebola. You should go to West Africa and distribute the drugs. Says right here from the University of Oxford, people who I respect. And every time I say something, people misinterpret it. So I could imagine that when I say something like this that I disagree, within minutes, my iPhone starts going bzz, bzz, bzz. So I expect I'm going to get a bzz in about 5 seconds. So what they're saying is that in a trial, a single-arm, open-label study of brincidofovir, of which there's essentially no evidence that it works in Ebola, would be given to all patients in the treatment. And we feel that you actually should do some sort of a design of a trial where you could find out if it works. And I'd love to get back to that in the panel and in the discussion. Let's go to number 2. Access to unproven drugs after you have a proven drug, and that is the concept of what we call parallel track. What is parallel track? Parallel track is to make available, with appropriate informed consent, an experimental intervention outside of the restrictions of a clinical trial to those individuals who cannot participate in the trial for a variety of reasons. There's a 300-patient trial in New York and you live in San Francisco, or you don't fit the exclusion criteria. Your hematocrit is 37 instead of 39, or the trial is fully enrolled. What do you do with those people who need to get involved in that? Well, let me tell you a little bit about how that evolved. And it really was a major sea change in my attitude towards the flexibility versus the rigidity of the scientific and regulatory community. It was really something that I have to say really, quite frankly, changed my life. And that is my relating to and putting myself in the place of a patient or a potential patient. And that was brought home to me by the AIDS activists, by a number of them. One in particular, Larry Kramer, who was my nemesis for years, who is now one of my very close and dear friends and has been a patient of mine. Larry early on was really prodding the gay community to act up, hence the word, against government indifference on HIV/AIDS. At the time, since I was unabashedly out there trying to get funds for an activity for HIV/AIDS when not very many people were interested in it, that was the good news. The bad news is that I became the face of the United States federal government. There were some good things about that because it really brought to my attention some of the things I never would have realized. Larry wanted to gain my attention, and he did. On the Sunday edition of the San Francisco Examiner, he wrote a paper called "I Call You Murderers," an open letter to an incompetent idiot, Dr. Anthony Fauci of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. So he caught my attention. And actually, even before he caught my attention, I was listening to things that he and his colleagues were saying when the scientific community, because of the theatrical nature of it, would shun the activist community, which was a big mistake. So they kept on putting the pressure. And just give you one example. They thought that I was a regulatory person as well as a scientist, and that I was preventing drugs from getting approved quickly. So they stormed the NIH and said, "Dr. Fauci, you're killing us," and putting me up there with Ronald Reagan about AL721. When they found out that I didn't work at the FDA, they said, well, then let's storm the NIH. And they did. But what they did in between them was give me the opportunity to sit down with them and listen to what they had to say. And there are so many people that I have interacted with, so many people in ACT UP, Greg Gonzalez and Mark Harrington and Peter Staley and on and on. But two of the people that really brought home to me the importance of accessibility of drugs when they're not within the context of a clinical trial. And that was Marty Delaney, who was one of the Buyers Club people who was converted immediately to understanding the clinical trial. And among many ACT UP members, Jim Igo, who was one of the founding members of ACT UP. And what they actually did was convince me by inviting me multiple times to San Francisco in the Castro district and into New York in the Village to understand what was going on there. And I'll give you an example of why I converted, and I'll explain to you how that happened. The federal government and the FDA thought this was anathema. Never should you violate the integrity of a clinical trial. There's exclusion criteria, there's a certain number that should go into a trial, and that's it. And it wasn't that they were bad people or insensitive. That's what we've been doing for decades and decades. So let me give you a couple of examples. After AZT was approved, the next drug was didanosine, or DDI, the second drug approved. It was tested and published in the New England Journal in a non-inferiority comparison with AZT. 3 limbs, AZT, low-dose DDI, high-dose DDI. The parallel track allowed distribution of DDI outside of the clinical trial because people were failing AZT. AZT alone as monotherapy lasted just in many people for several months. Yet we would not allow them to go on DDI if they failed or if they couldn't tolerate AZT. And when you're a bureaucrat in a room, you say, well, you know, that's just the way things go. Parallel track didn't accept that. The other one was the one that completely changed my mind, and it was the ganciclovir study. Ganciclovir is an experimental drug for CMV retinitis, but in the clinical trial for ganciclovir, one of the exclusion criteria, amazing, was that if you were on AZT, you couldn't be on ganciclovir, which means they wanted to make sure that the data were pristine. So Marty took me to San Francisco in the Castro district and showed me a few patients. The dilemma was either, and a patient told me this, so the alternative is either you go blind or you die. Because if you get off AZT, you die. If you're not on ganciclovir, you go blind. That was the thing that changed my mind about parallel track. So Marty invited me back to San Francisco and put me before a town hall meeting, and I got up and I took a deep breath and went against the United States federal government. And what I did was say, I actually embrace the parallel track. Little did I know that Marty, brilliant guy that he is, had invited to my talk 3 reporters, Randy Schiltz from the San Francisco Chronicle, someone from the LA Times, and Gina Colada from the New York Times. So after I finished, I got on the red eye to come back, and I thought for sure I was going to get fired. When I got back to Washington, D.C., I had a phone call from the White House saying they wanted to talk to me because it was a clear public repudiation of the FDA. Now, I don't have time to tell you the story, but I had become, for a variety of reasons, pretty good friends with George H.W. Bush. And his chief of staff called me and said, what is going on? And I explained to them about parallel track, and to my great amazement, they said, that sounds like a great idea. About an hour later, the FDA comes up and says, we totally agree with you. This is exactly what should be done. And in fact, 4 years later, they gave me and the chair and the commissioner of the FDA a certificate of appreciation. Now, the reason I say that, it's kind of funny, but how ideas and thoughts change when you really take a look at what's going on. And that was a purely activist job. I got credit. They should have given Jim Igoe and Marty Delaney the certificate of appreciation, certainly not me. Okay, let's go on to one that's really dicey and is right up until today is a problem. Clinical trials and what we call country-specific standard of care. You're all familiar with that. And that is, should the control arm of a clinical trial be the current standard of care in the country in which you're doing the trial, or should you apply the optimum standard of care as it exists in a wealthy country? So you're doing a study in Rwanda or in Namibia or in Tanzania. What is the control arm? And there are 2 of many examples of this, and I only have time to go through 2. One is prevention of mother-to-child transmission, and the other is when do you start antiretroviral therapy? And again, just 2 examples. The first, PMTCT, prevention of mother-to-child transmission. Prior to AZT availability, if you lived in a developing country, there was a 35% chance that you would transmit to your baby if you were an HIV-infected mother. And in the developing world, there was a 25% chance if you were in the United States or the UK with a good healthcare system. Following birth, there was an additional 18% chance that you would transmit it through breastfeeding. It was a serious problem. So we did a study, and the study was the now famous and iconic 076, in which if you took pregnant women and gave them AZT in the 2nd or 3rd trimester and AZT during labor and delivery, and then the newborn 6 weeks following birth, every 6 hours, give oral AZT, a dramatic decrease in mother-to-child transmission. That was terrific. The only trouble is the nations in Southern Africa couldn't afford this. So what do? You have to ask a question, what is it that they can afford? So what we did, and again, there's reasonable arguments on either side, we tried to develop a low dose or modification. There were multiple ones. There was lower doses of AZT. There was single dose nevirapine to the mother at labor, single dose to the baby within 24 to 48 hours following birth. But the control group was what was going on in the country. And what was going on in the country? Nothing. So we felt, the scientific community and the regulatory community, that the only way we figure that that works would be to have a placebo group, even though the standard of care in the United States was giving AZT. We got blasted. The ethics of clinical research in the third world, we had everyone from Marsha Angel, who you remember from the New England Journal of Medicine, and my good friend, actually, Sid Wolf and Peter Lorre, saying unethical trials of interventions to reduce perinatal transmission. Well, it hasn't gone away either, because now that we have the availability through PEPFAR, the question is, can they afford the absolute standard of care in the United States? And that is, you know, well, you all know, I'm telling you that standard of care is you treat the mother because she's infected. The secondary benefit is that the baby doesn't get infected and the mother is on therapy. You're not going to stop therapy on the mother, and the mother can then breastfeed. We don't do that in this country for reasons that we have good options, but you don't have options in the developing world. So the question is, what do you do with a trial? So we started a trial, and that is to determine 3 options, 3 ARV regimens, single drug during pregnancy, and then stop. 3-drug cocktail in pregnancy, and then stop. Or B+, a 3-drug cocktail indefinitely, which is standard of care in the United States, but may not be implementable in some countries. So in 2011 and 2013, WHO and other data supported, where feasible, that all pregnant women should receive B+. Then the question arose, is it ethical to continue this study to determine if B+ is better than A or B in protecting infants? Independent ethics reviews supported continuing the trial. But my life has never been easy. This was attacked. Critics questioned the ethics of allowing pregnant women to receive treatment that falls below the standard of their country. Now here is it gets complicated, because the standard is determined by the WHO, and the health ministers say, I don't care what the WHO says, I can't do this in my country. So what do you do? Do you do what the guidelines are, or do you do what's reasonable in the country? And we're going to get back to that in a second. As it turns out, it looks like B is better than A, and we're soon going to find out whether or not B+ with toxicity and economics and all the things work. So again, that's one of the gray zones. I'm not criticizing people who go one way or the other, but those are some of the problems you face. Point number 2, this is really difficult, because this is when to start antiretroviral therapy, what level of CD4 positive T cells. Now, the difficulty with this is the real example of a moving target. So with full disclosure, I take care of HIV-infected people all the time. I've been doing it for 33 years. If you're my patient, and this is no policy, be quiet, no policy, it's just what we do, what I do, is that if a patient comes in who's HIV-infected, I treat them. Because I've learned over the years that it's not good to have a replicating virus in you for a long period of time. So we did a study and said, when do you start? Right now, it has gone from less than 200 to less than 350 to less than 500 to treat everybody. I'm on this end of the spectrum. So we asked the question, the START study, It's called Strategic Timing of Antiretroviral Treatment. It's a randomized study that was designed when the WHO recommendation was start people less than 350. Okay, so there was a randomized, you start either greater than 500 or you wait until the count drops to less than 350 and then you start. 35 countries, they're listed on the slide. Enrollment begins in March 2009. But what happens? That's 2009. In 2013, the WHO comes out and says the new recommendations encourage all countries to initiate in adults with HIV when their CD4 count falls below 500. So think about it. Does a trial that says you wait to 350 versus less than 500, does that then become an unethical trial? I don't think so, but that's just my opinion, because the people in the country need to know the answer to the question we're asking. And again, with no criticisms to anybody, this is just some of the dilemmas you face. Okay, let's go to another one that was alluded to by David. What I call moral imperatives that may not be, Christine keeps correcting me when I incorrectly say ethics versus other things, but forgive me. So, is a moral imperative in global health, and why was I so involved in the birth of PEPFAR? And I just asked you a question, and I'm going to probably get criticized for this. Is a moral imperative mean it's an ethical obligation? So if something that you really think you should do, if you don't do it, is that unethical not to do it? I don't know. I'm just leaving that up as a question. So why do I bring that as an introduction? Well, in the year 2000, we were already 4 years into the triple combination that was in 1996 with the introduction of the protease inhibitors. And we had completely turned around the life expectancy of people. So when I was taking care of patients in 1981, the median survival was 6 to 8 months. I don't have time to show you all the data, but right now, if somebody comes into the same clinic that I saw the first patients in, and I put them on, if they're 25 years old and I put them on triple combination, I could look them in the eye and tell them that their projected life expectancy is about 50 years. So it's just short of the normal life expectancy in this country. That's right here in the United States, UK, Australia, Canada. What about Africa? And what happened in Africa is that they borrowed a page from the playbook of our gay activists. In fact, Greg Gonzalez, who you'll see on the panel, was very important down in South Africa, spent a lot of time there doing a lot of really very good things. And they were saying, we really need therapy, but the world said, there's no way that you're going to be able to get people in Africa to take drugs 3 times a day. Wow, just think about that for a second. But we weren't quite sure that that was the case, nor was, with all great credit to him, the President of the United States. So George Bush sent me and Tommy Thompson. I show Tommy's picture. Most people don't know who he is now because he was HHS secretary, but a phenomenal guy. He and I went to Africa for a couple of weeks with the president specifically telling me to look around to see if this was feasible. So we visited a whole bunch of countries to ask the question, if you provided drugs, could you in fact turn around HIV? Could you get people to prevent infection, to treat infection, and to go into care? So we took a look, and this is just one of the countries we visited. This is in Uganda, where I hooked up with a 19-year-old girl who was part of an organization called TASO, the AIDS relief organization, and we went into the far way out area in Uganda by Tororo, following her on her motorcycle, and she had a bunch of drugs in there. We went to a village, and here we are in the village, and the people understood what the drug was. They took their drug regularly, and it was clear all they needed the drug. Long story short, came back, convinced the president. I didn't need to convince the president. I gave him the data. He made the decision, and then on January 28th of 2003, he announced the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief, which now 11 years later is maybe the best thing from a health standpoint the country has done. If you look at the data, that is now provide HIV testing for 56 million people, 14.2 million pregnant people, 7.7 million people are receiving antiretroviral, 240,000 infants in 2014 averted infection, 6.5 million voluntary male medical circumcisions, and more than 5 million orphans and vulnerable children. Last year, I had the opportunity to give a talk and to celebrate the 10th anniversary of PEPFAR, in which Secretary of State Kerry announced that through PEPFAR, 1 million babies born HIV-free. The reason I mention this to you is that to me now, if you look at the result of that, I actually think, and again, I'll get criticized, that moral imperative that the president did to do this, it would have almost been, in my respects, stretching the term, almost have been unethical not to do it, I think. But again, that's just my opinion. Okay, last one. Something I'm facing right now as we speak. An HIV vaccine. And it has to do with the relationship now with HIV and Ebola. And I entitle it, Careful of What You Wish For. So let's take a look at HIV versus Ebola. Some of you may know that we have been working on an Ebola vaccine now for over 10 years due to the biodefense work of thinking that this might be a bioterror, and then it merged into emerging infectious diseases. So we developed vaccines for things that are not currently major threats, but might be. That's when we started on Ebola. So in September, we did a phase 1 clinical trial in 20 healthy volunteers. The vaccine was extraordinarily good in chimpanzees, protected every one of them from lethal challenge with Ebola. We moved on September the 2nd into a phase 1 trial, 20 healthy volunteers at the NIH Clinical Center in Bethesda. It was well tolerated, 2 fevers, both of which resolved in 24 hours, really good antibody responses, titers comparable to the titers in the animal model that was protected with the same vaccine from a lethal challenge of Ebola. Really good. In addition, there were good CD8 responses. That was the phase 1 trial. As soon as that came out, and again, with no criticism to anyone, some individuals, this person happened to be from MSF, and MSF is doing a great job, said that if you do a vaccine trial, it's raising an ethical issue. Studies on efficacy in affected countries, and more so in at-risk populations, should not have a placebo or active control arm, as this cannot be defended ethically. Now, some of you who know a lot about this are saying, what is he talking about? But the fact is, this is the kind of thing we had to face. Now, what was my argument to do a controlled trial? Let's take a look at global health crises, HIV versus Ebola. So worldwide, 4,000 people die of AIDS every day. In Ebola, which is a terrible epidemic that I'm spending literally 24/7 for the last 3 months on, as some of you may know. From March 21st to today, a little over 6,000 people died of Ebola. So from Thursday, Friday, and today, twice as many people have died of HIV than have died of Ebola since the epidemic began. So therefore, one can reasonably make the argument, wait a minute, as soon as you get past the phase 1 trial with an HIV vaccine, just distributed in places where you have a 35% prevalence of HIV. I mean, that's a pretty logical argument. So let's take a look at what happened. There was a study, many studies, but this is one of them, which was called the STEP study. was sponsored by Merck in collaboration with NIH, using an Ad5 vector and GAG-PAL-NEF. The results in the animal model were very good, as were the Ebola results. We did a phase 1 study, wonderful safety profile. We looked at immunogenicity, pretty good immunogenicity in phase 1, 2A studies. So we initiated a phase 2 trial in 2004. But rather than saying, well, 4,000 people dying each day, this is a medical emergency, let's just distribute this promising phase 1 study. Well, let's take a look at what happened. We did a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial in 3,000 HIV-negative volunteers at high risk. In 2007, the DSMB recommended discontinuation based on futility, no chance of proven efficacy, but importantly, subsequent analysis of data demonstrated a 41% increase of acquisition of HIV infection in vaccine group compared to the placebo control. It wasn't behavioral differences because it was a double-blind study. What it was that the adenovector activated T cells and made them more susceptible. So what would have happened if we had distributed widely this vaccine in Southern Africa? I cannot even imagine what would the blowbacks of what that would be. So with that as a background, I'm going to say the one definitive thing that I will say, and I say this multiple sides, and that is, in my mind, and I testified before the United States Congress on November the 19th and said this, that in my mind, it is unethical and highly problematic to distribute broadly in any country, particularly a developing country in Africa, an experimental vaccine without proof of efficacy and proof of a lack of harm. That's a vaccine, and sometimes people confuse a vaccine with a therapy. You're not giving experimental therapy to a sick person. You're giving vaccine to a healthy population. And that's what I think is something that really needs to be very seriously considered. So in closing, I've gone over 5 issues, certainly not all of the issues that we have faced over the last 33+ years with HIV, but I think they are food for thought that are things that are not really just for the historic archives, but things that actually are going to be faced in different diseases, not only infectious diseases, time and time again, which was actually one of the reasons why I enthusiastically agreed to come and talk to you this morning. Thank you.